This is a University of Otago podcast.
Hello and welcome to Otago University Vote Chat 2011. In this episode of Vote Chat, I interviewed ACT MP Heather Roy, but unfortunately for technical reasons we lost the first few minutes of the recording. So we jump back now to it where I was asking Heather Roy about who is actually going to lead the ACT party after the next election, Don Brash or John Banks. Because I think there's no doubt that John Banks will win Epsom. I had to think if it was Brash, Banks for a moment.
Definitely Banks.
Yeah, definitely Banks. He'll win it. Won't that essentially make him the leader? Won't that essentially give him all the leverage in the party?
Well, it makes him a very important person in the party. Don Brash isn't standing in any electorate, but actually it's important that I think party leaders are very busy, particularly in smaller parties where you've not got the same numbers, and so he needs to focus on the whole country. I think the two of them actually work pretty well together. I've observed that, and I don't think that does automatically make John Banks the leader.
Okay. So I imagine you've had a bit to do with John Banks over the last few months since he suddenly became a member.
And previously.
Previously?
Yeah.
So what's your relationship with him like?
Oh, I've just come in contact with him in a number of different ways. He was obviously a media commentator. He had his radio show where we were frequently interviewed by him, those sorts of interactions.
Of course. I mean, people say again that he is socially conservative. He's not an ACT person. He's not even economically that right-wing in some respects. So isn't he a terrible fit for ACT? Isn't he just part of the problem?
Well, I think time will tell. No, I don't think he is part of the problem. I think that he's actually pretty popular amongst our membership and our supporters, and he's got a track record. He is more socially conservative than I would consider myself to be, but that's a decision that the board has had to make and has made. It's not for just one individual like myself to make, and time will tell.
Okay, it's very diplomatic. Right, I'm just wondering if there's anyone else wanting to jump in here with questions. James has got some questions or Twitter responses.
Yeah, there's just, you were talking about before about ACT's place in Parliament under MMP. Obviously there is some criticism about MMP in that the tail can wag the dog. From what I'm understanding from you, you don't necessarily agree with that. So what do you think about that statement?
I think MMP's got its pros and cons like any system. Personally, I quite like MMP because I think it's brought much broader representation to Parliament. I wouldn't have been an MP, for example, under just a two-party system. I like the freedom of believing in things, or being sort of truer to our principles than a bigger party has the luxury of being. And I don't agree, sometimes you get accommodations, so sometimes you get wins, but it's not the smaller party always getting the wins. So sometimes the tail's wagging the dog, but that certainly isn't what's happening all the time. Yeah, and in fact people, of course, this election will have an opportunity to vote for or against MMP as our continued electoral system.
What will you vote for?
I'm not actually very keen on any of the systems. I probably will vote in favour of MMP, but what I want to see are fewer MPs in Parliament. I think we should have listened to the 1999 referendum to have 99 MPs. 83% of people wanted that. I think we're a small country and we don't need 120, and I want to see a 4-year term. And I would have supported a system that actually primarily saw fewer MPs. None of the options actually explore that at all.
Okay, we've got another question in the audience. Nikki Lomax, a politics honours student.
I was just wondering how in your life, early 20s, things like that, led you to hold the political, ideological views that you do now, like where it kind of came from for you? Yeah,
I think for everybody their experiences and their upbringing are a big part of it. In my early 20s was when my involvement with the New Zealand Party first started, and I was pretty green in those days, I have to say. I had strong opinions about individual things, like welfare reform I had a big thing about, but my opinions weren't well shaped or formed. I think the involvement that I had, that was my introduction to politics, and that did start shaping things for me for the future, but it wasn't. I was 37 when I went to Parliament, and so things had moved a long way then, and you know, a number of things in my life had changed, like I had children, for example, and having children does mean that it brings a different perspective to your life. So those sorts of things make a difference to you, but I think that I've always basically had that economic and social liberalism as a theme, but my opinions, I think, have developed over time.
Do you come from a family that's like that, or was it?
I come from a pretty conservative family, really, but one where roadblocks weren't put up in my way when I wanted to explore things, and I was never, even if it was a sort of a crazy idea, that was never curtailed or stymied. And I think that those sorts of experiences mean that you can take some risks and you learn in your own way.
How soon are we going to get the parasites out of the student body and bring in VS, they're living off the backs of students, and bring in VSM?
The VSM bill's had a long and torturous history, and I'm hoping that next Wednesday we'll have the third reading, which will go right through, and voluntary student membership will be law, and so students won't have to pay a compulsory fee starting from the 1st of January next year.
Okay, James.
I was asked this via email earlier in the week. Are you concerned about the use of urgency potentially for the search and surveillance legislation disrupting Members' Day next week?
I think that Members' Day is going to be okay. I'm concerned always about the use of urgency.
So in general, what are your views on urgency?
On urgency, I think they should be used for matters that truly are urgent, not to just clear the order paper out. And in particular, I don't mind the odd reading being taken through urgency if it just expedites the process where things are pretty clear. What I particularly object to is no select committee process, so that people with a vested interest or even with a peripheral interest have the opportunity to make submissions on particular pieces of legislation.
Okay, so on the issue of the search and surveillance issue of the moment, ACT's been making up its mind over the last few days about whether to support the national government's fix-it legislation, about whether to bail out the police essentially on the current issues going through the court. I've said in the media that a few MPs within ACT were pretty much against the bill, and I guess they've won their day within that caucus. Was that one of you? Were you one of those people?
We sort of have. I think it's a pretty complex issue, actually. It's not just black and white. And so we've had the Solicitor General brief us. We wanted a select committee process, and we were against the bill, no matter where people's standpoints were. We were against the bill being raced through the House under urgency without a process. And so we've negotiated a select committee process. It'll be a slightly curtailed one, but at least people will have the chance to make submissions on that bill. Personally, I think it's about getting the balance right. I've got some grave concerns about the police having wide sweeping powers to go onto people's property. Particularly, I think property rights need to be protected, but we also want the police to be able to catch criminals, and so how do you get that balance right?
So I'm a bit confused here. Are ACT going to support the bill?
We're supporting it at its first reading, and then we'll see what comes out of the select committee.
So you have issues about the actual principles in it as well as the process that's
absolutely.
been... Okay.
Yeah, and that's my concern. I think that the principles need to be carefully thought through. I also think that it's a bit sort of cute. We've got a search and surveillance bill that's been winding its way through the House for the best part of 3 years. Sure. It covers exactly these issues that we're talking about. So why wasn't it important enough 6 weeks ago to actually get that moving, when suddenly we've got a Supreme Court finding that some politicians don't particularly like, so we've got to have urgency to rectify the situation. Okay.
Now, someone's already brought up VSM. Oh, and there's a question at the back which we'll jump to.
Do you feel deeply compromised by the contradictions in ACT's economic policy? For instance, in health, it's based on the privatisation of the voucher policy, which Roger Douglas said right here on campus simply would not work in the face of the contemporary evidence on DNA. In the case of education, we have a basically tribal procedure which is leading to great misallocation of resources, and where the voucher system again runs into all sorts of intergenerational issues, and the investment pattern is right across the standard ACT takes. In transport, we refuse to apply market forces and the proper costings. In the case of resources, we have refused to take account of the full resource costs. Across the board, we see you systematically eschewing the market mechanism, the true prices, and yet on other occasions resorting to a market where we don't have the information and the ground conditions for basic economics to apply.
So ACT aren't market-based enough. You're not letting market into these decisions?
My short answer to that question is that I don't feel compromised at all, and I'm not sure that you've got the right end of the stick with some of those issues. Health, for example, we're not promoting vouchers. We've actually, we would like to see health savings plans in place. You'll hear more of that as the election approaches, so that people are paying, sometimes with the assistance of their employer, into savings plans that they can then use for their health care. I think that health and education particularly, are big black holes for money, and we have to find better ways, given that particularly in health, that we've got a rapidly ageing population that is going to draw more and more on the state under the current system.